industry, we all share the same goals to provide the patient with the best possible contact lens experience. From the early 1940s until now, the objectives have been the same. We should design and produce a contact lens from the best materials available, to the best design we know, and to the highest quality that we are capable of. Various approaches to these objectives have been attempted, some with greater levels of success than others. And there are challenges that arise as the science begins to point us in the correct direction. One of these directions entails the objective of improving oxygen transmission levels to the patient's eyes. This has led to a concerted industry effort to create contact lens materials that can transmit high levels of oxygen without sacrificing other critical design goals. Today, I will outline the results from a number of pilot studies that we have conducted, where our objective was to try and emulate what the patient really experiences during contact lens wear. These studies were run with daily disposable contact lenses, as they represent a large and growing segment of the contact lens market. 3 criteria that would make up the ideal properties in a contact lens would include preservation of healthy corneal metabolism, would include comfort and the maintenance of the contact lens's hydration, and thus preserve a stable tear film. The ideal contact lens would also provide the patient with a near perfect wearing experience. No discomfort from the point of insertion until removal, no deposition, and a long-term healthy eye. But that's a perfect solution. This is still a dream, and more material and design research is needed before this holy grail can be achieved. During the years of growth and development, however, various requirements for the optimal contact lens have emerged. We can produce lenses with sophisticated optical performance, from aberration-managed spherical lenses to complex rotationally asymmetric toric lenses. We understand more about the physiological needs of the eye and the amount of oxygen transmissibility that a contact lens should possess in order to support a healthy physiological state. We are also more concerned about the comfort requirements for satisfactory contact lens wear and the key criteria to minimize contact lens-related inflammation. So in an ideal world, we should be able to map these factors and confirm them in the material or design before the contact lens even reaches the patient's eye. In fact, this is largely what we attempt to do when a new lens or material is designed and developed. In the world of soft disposable lenses, one of the key requirements expected is a lens material that transmits sufficient oxygen to the eye. The older mid-water content hydrogels with permeabilities of DK of 18 to 24 are competing with next generation silicone hydrogels now that provide both reasonable water contents and higher oxygen permeability. So today I wanted to share some recent work we have explored in this area by looking at contact lens friction in a novel way as it relates to oxygen permeability and material makeup. One of the key ocular requirements, that being sufficient oxygen transmissibility, is largely satisfied with modern materials, particularly with the plethora of silicone hydrogel lenses on the market. But even standard hydrogels provide sufficient oxygen for safe daily disposable wear. So if we look at that and say DK is sufficiently satisfied for the modern contact lens, then what should be the new DK? Should it be comfort, wettability, friction? How do we define them? So we looked at the end-of-day comfort via the mechanism of wettability, and we observed a fundamental difference in wetting and tear behavior between silicone hydrogel lenses and hydrogel lenses, and we wanted to explore this further. We all know the ability of hydrogels to be comfortable and wettable, but we also know that they tend to dehydrate towards the end of the day. But we also see that silicone hydrogels can attract lipids and mucus, and in turn also end up with a disrupted tear film at the end of the day. Comfort is a key driver for patient retention, and certainly an area of high interest for contact lens researchers, perhaps it being the final frontier for successful long-term wear. Friction is a well-known factor in this equation, but may not be as readily understood as modulus or decay, nor may it be well understood in the way it's being measured and published. But we do know that with the coefficient of friction, as it's lower and lower, the comfort will increase to a level that is higher and higher. We also know that there's plenty of in vitro data that can give the eye care practitioner an understanding of the friction coefficients of the lenses that they're going to select for their patients. And this data looks straightforward, but is it really meaningful when it comes to what the lens does as it fits to the eye? So we wanted to look at the in vitro world versus the real world and look at the issue from a patient's perspective and try and find a meaningful way to test friction in a real world situation. We felt that if we could do that, we would understand what happens in the eye of the individual patient. It could also give us insights into the ideal material properties that we should be aiming to provide. So we set up a study to look at surface friction based upon the lens being worn in the eye of the patient. We wanted to review the in vitro friction values compared with ex vivo values with differing lens types. We also wanted to see if ex vivo values change with time over lens wear. So the study we performed also highlighted some possible material-based trends, that is, friction changes over time, which may become clearer over a longer wearing period. There may be various deposition factors on either side, whether they be hydrogel or silicon hydrogel, that could also contribute to differing friction outcomes. And we felt it would be interesting to further analyze the lenses after wear for such possibility. We selected 4 lens types, 2 silicon hydrogel and 2 hydrogel. Each of the lens types had slightly different characteristics and different coefficients of frictions and differing ways to deal with friction. As it was a pilot study, we used 10 eyes. During the lens wear, patients continued with their daily activities and the measurements were taken at specific intervals. The in vitro measurements at 0 hours were the baseline, and then we took measurements at 2 hours, 5 hours, and 8 hours. All measurements were taken at a room temperature of 23 degrees and relative humidity of 50%. The measuring process was thus: we placed the lens on the convex surface of the lens facing downwards. It was removed from the eye in a sterile manner in such a way that it would not interfere with any of the tear film on the contact lens in the area that was going to be measured. We applied a load force of 17 grams and 2 microliters of ISO saline was placed between the lens and the glass. So in practice, the patient would wash their hands thoroughly before removing the lens, then take the lens out from the very, very periphery and not handle the optical area at all so that this would not be contaminated during the measuring process. In the measuring process, there was a cap that was placed over the lens to hold it in place and expose the area that was going to be measured on the friction jig. The lens was placed downwards, convex surface facing outwards, as you can see. It was measured at a 5mm point along a 30mm circumferential path on the glass. This was to approximate the action of the upper lid, and a typical upper lid movement in a Japanese female is around 6.8mm on the upwards blink and approximately 6.2 on the downwards blink. As you can see, 2 microliters of ISO saline was placed between the glass and the lens. Point of contact was around 5mm, so we had sufficient area to measure. And the arcuate movement was made of around about 30mm, of which 5mm became the relevant measuring area. The entire time it took to measure was around about 60 seconds from lens removal to the completion of the readings. So to the measurements, the baseline, as you can see here, is the published in vitro measurements from each of the manufacturers. with Shiro being 0.031 newtons, total 1 being 0.019 newtons, Miru, which is a Hemagima hydrogel, being 0.05325 newtons, and AccuView which is etofilcon with PVP, 0.0355 newtons. So these became the baseline for the beginning of the ex vivo measurements. In all cases, the ex vivo friction values increased over the 2-hour time point after lens insertion. The silicon hydrogel lenses experienced the greatest increase in friction, but the general level of friction either stabilized somewhat or even decreased between the 5 hours and 8 hours wearing times. As we can see from 0 to 2, the friction goes up, starts to level off over to the 5 hours, and then towards the end of the wearing period, the friction values either slowly decrease or remain quite constant. So we average those friction values, which has a level of around approximately 0.06 newtons for the 4 types of lenses, and then we looked at what happened for each particular type of lens on an intra-patient basis. And this can be seen, again, starting from the in vitro measurement point. If we look over the time periods of 2 hours, 5 hours, and 8 hours, we can see with the silicon hydrogel, there is a high level of intra-time and intra-patient friction variation over that time of wearing. The total 1 is the same. We're starting around about 0.02 newtons, 2 hours, 5 hours, and 8 hours wear. There is still a relatively high level of intra-patient variation in friction across the wearing time. AccuView Moist from 0 to 2 hours, 5 hours, and 8 hours shows a much more consistent experience for the individual patients in terms of friction. The other hydrogel, which is Hemagima, from 0 to 2 hours, 5 hours, and 8 hours, again, there is a similarly consistent experience.
Tienes una cita presencial con tu preparación académica, con los profesionales de la salud visual de América Latina, con los negocios.
Asegura tu cupo en franjafedopto2021.com inscripciones.
Enfrentando eficazmente la era digital.
So what we found that there was a significant difference between in vitro and ex vivo values in the first place, and we noted that these values varied with material. We also found the differences between individual patients' responses to those hydrogel materials versus silicon hydrogel materials in terms of friction values. So to us, the study highlighted some possible material-based trends with friction changing over time and by material, which may become clearer over a longer wearing period. So we elected to do an extension of that time to a 12-hour wearing. So we repeated the friction study. Same patients, same 10 eyes, but this time we shortened the initial time point to a quarter of an hour, then included 2 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, and 12 hours. We wanted to see whether or not the actual increase in friction was occurring over a longer period of time or whether in fact it happened as you put the lens in the eye. So 15 minutes was considered as good a time as we could manage in terms of controlling the lens insertion, stabilizing, and removal. We found a similar trend with the 8-hour study, but found that the coefficient of friction increased within the first 15 minutes. This highlights the possibility that in vivo friction changes may occur even in a shorter period of time than 15 minutes, only we couldn't measure it. This effect would seem to indicate that the need for sufficient lens settling times to be allocated to allow better lens-eye interaction as the patient is first presenting to the practitioner. It can also be seen that after the 15 minutes, the similarities to the 8-hour test come to bear with the friction increasing, then at 5 hours reaching pretty much its peak, then beginning to descend again over the 8-hour period. And then interestingly, out to 12 hours, all lenses had a decrease in the friction values. So again, we set the average coefficient of friction for the 4 lenses under test. This was very similar to the first test that we conducted, around the 6 or 0.6 newtons. And then we looked again at the interpatient frictional values for each individual lens type. And we found similar kind of tendency towards the 8-hour study, that there was a very high intrapatient variability in friction over the course of the wearing day, and extending in the case of the first silicone hydrogel out to 12 hours. In the second, with total 1, we can see that the values of friction increase pretty much immediately going into the eye, then fairly consistent, but with some intrapatient variability across the wearing time. Then as it gets out to 12 hours, there is a sense of consistency coming back into the friction. Again, as we saw in the 8-hour study with the hydrogel lenses, the friction values stayed relatively consistent from patient to patient across the entire wearing period, including the 12-hour extension now. Same with hemangioema, we can see that the friction increases or decreases as the lens is inserted, then stays very tightly grouped across the wearing time to the end of the day. So this study again highlighted the possible material surface-based trends in terms of friction changing over time, and the possibility of intrapatient variable responses to different types of lenses. We found that the friction differences between in vitro data and ex vivo results occurred very quickly after the lenses were inserted. So we don't believe that in vitro data is enough to give the true picture of in vivo lens performance, and we think that better data could be provided to the eye care practitioner going forward. Thank you for your attention.